Given by Rose Pavlow.
I have illusions. Yeah, I'm getting shorter all the time, too. Not much fun. Anyway, can you hear me all right? Is this okay? Yes? If not, please let me know. This is a note from, I'm not going to read from this book, this is wonderful. Will Moses, Johnny Appleseed, The Story of a Legend. It's in the children's library, but it's really wonderful for grown-ups too. And you can't have it for another 2 weeks. This author's note says, nearly everyone has heard a tale or two about Johnny Appleseed. Now, what many people don't realize, that Johnny Appleseed was in fact a real flesh and blood man who truly lived an amazing and exciting life 2 centuries ago. John Chapman, or as we more commonly know him, Johnny Appleseed is one of the great characters from American history. He lived his life by a strict code of morality, honesty, and kindness to all creatures. He devoted his life to helping others help themselves, providing apple trees, herbs, and friendship to settlers all across the wild frontier of Middle America. John Chapman was a pioneer, probably the country's first nurseryman, certainly one of its great agriculturists, and without a doubt, a great man. Now, in many ways, Johnny Appleseed represents the best qualities of the American character. He was born on the brink of the American Revolution, and as a young man helped blaze the trail westward. His apple trees and orchards served as living beacons for settlers to follow on their migration. Today, it is Johnny's good character that may serve as even better and stronger beacon to follow. He was generally good-natured, filled with kindness and humanity, had an industrious spirit, and was a generous friend to all. And there's no doubt that Johnny was profoundly spiritual. He had a vision that angels told him that it was his mission in life to wander about the country planting apple trees so that the wilderness might be golden, be glad, and blossom forth in the forest. Now, he loved to tell stories. And of course, some of them, as a storyteller, it's not meant, but it's just to enhance his story, becomes a little exaggerated. But one of his favorite ones was the story about his half-brother, who was not a frontiersman, who was more of a city kid. His mother had died when he was young, and his father went out and he married a nice young woman, and he had 10 kids. So Johnny was grown up as in a family of 12 children. Do you wonder why he went off into the wilderness? So anyway, this is one of the many tales that he liked to tell about himself. And this is one tale he loved to tell about the time his half-brother Nathaniel came to live with him on French Creek in northwestern Pennsylvania. When I was still a young man, I walked barefoot across the Allegheny Plateau, and I began planting apple seeds in the wilderness. I sold my seedlings to settlers right there on the frontier. They could eat apples right from their own trees, make apple butter and apple cider, and dry what was left to sustain them in the winter. My business prospered, and one day I wrote a letter to my half-brother back in Longmeadow, Massachusetts. Dear Nathaniel, I'm making a comfortable living here on French Creek. There's plenty of work for 2, and I would welcome your company. Please come soon. Your half-brother, John. I carried the letter to Mr. Hale's trading post. Some of these pictures are fantastic. You might want to look at them afterward. Nathaniel rode with the settlers' wagons, went to Fort Pitt, and made his last leg of the journey up the Allegheny River from Fort Pitt to French Creek by flatboat. On the way, They teased him some, people who knew Johnny Appleseed. I hear tell your brother John wears a pot for a hat. And he just wears burlap sacks for clothing. Well, instead of listening to such foolishness, Nathaniel might better have spent his time learning something useful about life in the wilderness. When he finally arrived in French Creek, I wasn't far off. "You can climb ashore here, Sonny," I heard the boatman shout. Then I heard Nathaniel ask, "But where's the house? And where's my big brother John?" I expect your big brother is off in the woods someplace discussing with squirrels, chuckled the boatman. "And I'll just bet a pig in a poke that big old hollow sycamore tree is your new home." "Watch out for Injuns, Sonny," I heard the fool shout as he pushed off, leaving poor Nathaniel alone. If the boy's ears had worked as well as the boy's ears ought to work, he'd have heard me right there behind him. But when I picked him up and swung him around like a scarecrow, he looked as though he'd been snatched up by the spirit world. "Bless you, Nathaniel," I said gently. "Fear no evil. I'm your brother. Nowadays, folks call me Appleseed John." Oh, and then this picture of this scared kid, scared out of his mind. He was used to the city, not to the wild country. I made a fire and boiled some corn into mush. And Nathaniel didn't like the look of it, but he gobbled up his share and most of mine like a half-starved mongrel dog. Then he made himself comfortable inside a cozy sycamore tree. There was a commodious bed of leaves and blankets that I didn't use much, preferring, as I still do, I like to sleep under the stars. Over the next days, we began gathering nuts and berries, and we stored our provisions in a hinged box so that the friendly critters could not go helping themselves. We wandered all through the forest, preparing our seedlings to weather the bitter cold. Autumn ended abruptly that year with an early snowstorm. At first, we decorated our camp with snow angels and built ice sentinels along the creek. In the evening, I read to Nathaniel, and we discussed the great ideas contained in our books. We talked of planting and harvesting apple trees in the spring. At night, I slept like a bear. But Nathaniel soon began discontented. He snuggled inside the sycamore, wrapped in every stitch of warm clothing he had carried from Massachusetts, and he munched nuts and dried fruit. "This isn't exactly what I expected," he complained. "I'm freezing. I wish we had a proper house with doors and windows and a stove." The worst of it all, his munching soon depleted our stores. Before long, we had more than 3 fingers worth of dried fruit and nuts left in the hinged boxes. There wasn't anything else to do but risk canoeing downriver to Fort Pitt, where I could purchase enough to feed us both until spring. Nathaniel sort of whined, and "Why can't I come along too?" "River travel can be dangerous in winter," I explained, wrapping myself in a blanket and pulling a small pot from its peg. "It's much safer here." "You're not planning to wear that mush pot on your head?" Nathaniel asked. "Sure am," I replied. "It's more useful than any hat. Keeps my head dry. I can cook in it. And once I used it to discourage an unreasonable copperhead. Ain't much a man need fear when he's got a mush pot on his head." I started out paddling rapidly down the half-frozen Allegheny, but big chunks of floating ice made it rough going. Finally, in the late afternoon, I pulled my canoe up on top of a huge cake of ice and stretched out, comfortable as a duke. I closed my eyes for a short nap. I don't know if you can see this picture of it, but he certainly was a very fearless man. There he is lying down in comfort.